Welcome to 8 with 8, a podcast from Ohio State Support Team 8, where we share what's on our minds and what's in the research from the field of education. In special education, we talk all the time about access to the general education curriculum for students with disabilities and how critical it is. In fact, that's the whole point of having an IEP, to make sure that students have the knowledge and skills necessary to access the general ed curriculum. But what if we've been thinking about curriculum the wrong way? What if we thought differently about what exactly it is we're giving access to and how we go about doing it? Today, we welcome special guest Shawna Benson. Shawna is the program director for the Center for Teaching Diverse Learners at the Ohio Center for Autism and Low Incidence, known by Ohioans as OCALI. Shawna will be talking with our own Dee Dee House about how we can reset our understanding of curriculum to transform teaching and learning for students with disabilities. And stick around for the whole episode because she tells us about a brand new online resource designed for this very purpose.
Hi, everyone. I'm Dee Dee Howes, a special education consultant here at State Support Team Region 8. And today I am so fortunate to have my friend Shawna Benson from OCALI here with us. And Shawna, thanks for joining me.
Thanks, Dee Dee, for having me. I appreciate it.
So I'm going to dive right in, Shawna. I was excited to talk to you because, one of the things that I notice is that we hear the term curriculum sort of bantied around across not only our region and state, but even nationally. And it's occurred to me that people are using that term in different ways and ascribing very different meanings to it. And I know that this is an area that you do a tremendous amount of work in. So I really wanted to just pick your brain a little bit and ask you to share, what does it mean when we use that word curriculum? What exactly are we talking about?
Great. That's a great question. And you're right. People are using that term an awful lot. IDEA uses that term, access to the general education curriculum under FAPE, or free appropriate public education. And really what that is speaking to when they use that term curriculum is really about the outlined outcomes, really, or the standards that each of the subject areas and grade levels are bringing to students as they progress in their school program, kind of the scope and sequence from the time they enter school to the time they leave it. It's really what are the learning targets that really makes up the curriculum for students. And so the standards are very much associated with that term curriculum. I do know that some people will use the term curriculum and they may be referencing resources or materials that they're using, but those are really curricular tools. So that doesn't dictate the curriculum, but those are tools that people use as students are kind of learning those standards, or really focusing in on what it is they're supposed to be learning in each of the subject areas and grade level.
Okay, that makes sense. It sounds like you're saying curriculum really is the state identified standards at each grade level.
That's correct.
But so often when folks talk about curriculum, you're saying they're talking about whatever packaged program or something they've purchased from a vendor, or just the tools that they're using in their specific building or district. Right.
That's often the case. Yeah.
Okay, I get that. That makes sense what you've explained. So let me ask you this then. Why, what does it matter, I guess, if they use the term interchangeably? Why is it so important that we distinguish between the two?
Yeah. So when we think about the general education standards, or the standards that are outlined as part of the curriculum across each of the grade levels, it really outlines the targets, like I said, for what's supposed to be taught. And really what students are supposed to be learning and achieving at each of the grade levels. And sometimes what happens when there's a vendor tool, remember a lot of the vendor tools or programs, the prepackaged tools that we've talked about, those are sold across the nation oftentimes. And in some states, they're aligned with certain standards and aspects of that state curriculum or the standards for each of the grade levels. But in other states, it may be a little bit different. States have some different, nuances in the standards. And Sometimes those curricular tools are well aligned with the standards, but on occasion there are curricular tools that may not be well aligned to those targets or standards or outcomes. So when we say we want students to have access to the general curriculum, we want to make sure that that access really is representative of the grade level content itself. And sometimes curricular tools can be on track for grade level learning, but sometimes on occasion curricular tools can take us down the wrong road. Maybe they're not aligned well with the grade level the student's in, but maybe grade levels behind or ahead. And so we want to make sure really that the student has access to the learning at the grade level. And that's super important for all students, but for sure for students with disabilities, it's equally as important.
That makes sense. I get exactly what you're saying. And I am glad that you are helping us really understand the difference between the two. And I guess I hadn't thought about the fact that that those curricular tools may not be aligned to our Ohio learning standards. So that really makes me think about another question, and I would imagine that our listeners might ponder this as well. So for a classroom teacher who has been given a set of curricular tools or resources that the district uses, and they're told this is, what you're supposed to follow, and they've got a pacing guide, et cetera, what would you suggest that they do then? How can they ensure that they are, in fact, targeting the right things, that they are, in fact, making sure that everything that they're doing is aligned to the learning standards?
Right. That's a great question. And I think that there are some action steps that teachers can take, not only teachers, but also districts, of course, curriculum departments, grade level teachers or teacher teams could all potentially take the same step here. But if it's an individual teacher, the same rule applies. Teachers can go through a curriculum audit of sorts between the academic standards for the subject area or areas and grade level or grade levels that they're teaching, and do a correlation really or an audit of the curricular tools that the district has selected. And really it is truly kind of that correlation piece where we're looking at the grade level standards, we're digging into the curricular tool, and we're trying to locate the explicit instruction that would be present in that curricular tool for those particular standards. And there are three aspects really of a curriculum audit. One is the standards piece. So that's where we kind of provide that access to the general curriculum. And we do that standard by standard correlation that I just spoke about. There is also a need to really dig into whether or not the language and literacy skill sets that come out of the reading research are represented in the curricular tools that we're talking about. So there are very specific skill sets according to the reading research that should also be part of those curricular tools, again, depending on age and grade level and even across subject areas. So foundational skills would need to be present in those early learning curricular tools, especially for English language arts. But also we want to build background knowledge and vocabulary in other subjects as well. So it's also important to take a look at ELA across the subjects as well. And then lastly is an access kind of audit. So oftentimes when districts select curricular tools, sometimes they will be very conscientious about picking tools that align to the grade level standards, but sometimes those curricular tools are not as flexibly designed for differentiation and the different needs or universal design features. We're really taking a look at those kinds of flexible features, flexible options in the curricular tool that will allow all of our students to really participate. And the flexibility to integrate student-specific supports and services. So if they use specialized modes of communication to access the curriculum or specialized tools, assistive technologies, and materials to access that general curriculum, we want that curricular tool to be very flexible and allow students to utilize all of those special supports that come along with their IEP in Section 7 typically.
Oh, that is such a good point, Shawna. That when you think about whatever curricular tools, whatever resources are being utilized, how critical it is that there's that adaptability to allow for accommodations or modifications if it becomes necessary. So yeah, that's such a good point. And as you were talking about that, it made me think, when you talked about a curricular audit, it really made me think about how critical it is that teachers and teacher teams and districts have the skills to be able to unpack the standards, why that's so important. And I know that sometimes, teachers learn that early on in their preparation programs at universities and colleges, and then don't necessarily touch it again. But that kept coming back to me, that you really do need to be able to unpack the standards so that you are looking at it and then all of those skills broken down, and you can see that correlation between whatever program or whatever tools and resources you might be using to the actual standards. So that's such a great point. And, you talked about making sure that we can provide access to that general curriculum for all of our learners. So can you talk just a little bit about that? I know that is what we hear most often is a struggle for teachers with diverse learners in a single classroom. How can they, at the classroom level, ensure access for all learners to that general curriculum?
Great. Again, another really good question. And you had mentioned already the teacher knowledge being a critical element here, with the ability from a teacher perspective to know the standards deeply and broadly, deep enough to know every single skill that is part of that grade level learning, but also broadly enough to understand that there were skills that came prior to the grade level that are foundational oftentimes to the students' learning at that grade level marker. And even sometimes our ability to understand that there are skills that are going to follow later in grade levels coming soon. So a lot of that teacher knowledge piece is a really critical element to ensuring that all of our students are able to access the general curriculum. We would talk about that stretch in the deconstruction of the standards as really a learning progression or a learning pathway that really begins from an engagement level or an engagement perspective, where we want students to be engaged in the content and subject areas at hand, whatever the topics and concepts are that are part of that grade level curriculum. We want to make sure that the students are engaging with those, no matter their complexity of disability and access. So we want to make sure that the teachers really understand how to bring all learners on board with learning through a learning progression. And that comes from an assessment and an instructional standpoint. Explicit instruction really requires educators to teach small skills, bringing every student along into the grade level concepts and explicitly helping to build their understanding of every single standard that's part of the curriculum. And in order to do that, they really have to be well versed in the content and all of those little discrete skills that make up a standard. A standard is really more of a large package of skills that have come together to form this final product or outcome for a subject area or grade level. But from a teaching standpoint, we know that it is really build upon, like, skills that have built upon themselves that the teacher has explicitly taught. And then all of those skills come together to equate to this outcome called that standard. And so we need to know from a teaching perspective how to build our instruction across that learning progression, and also to build and utilize assessments across that learning progression to really showcase what students know and understand, and what students may still need and maybe even struggling with in some cases, where we would have to add maybe extra layers of instruction sometime, or specially designed instruction sometime. So we want to make sure that those skill sets are in place for all educators, both intervention specialists and content specialists, and that every educator is really well versed about, and we talked about this just a bit ago with our audit, every educator really needs to understand how supports and services from any IEP, really, or other specialized learning plan. I think about also students who are English language learners and who have other facets of need, from reading and literacy perspective to even advanced knowledge and skills, how to bring all of those supports and services into that curriculum and into that general instruction in Tier 1. And I feel like when teachers have all of that knowledge and skill and they come together collaboratively to provide wraparound support for instruction and assessment, that all of our kids really can learn this content. We can make that content come alive by showing kids how subject areas are connected to one another and how the content itself is really vibrant and experiential oftentimes. So there are a lot of things that teachers can do to really provide access to the general curriculum.
That's amazing. And, as I listened to you explaining that, I thought over and over, it is a challenging profession, isn't it, that we're in?
Mm-hmm.
And it is a tall order that we're asking of teachers. And it's so vital that as educators, we ourselves are lifelong learners. And as things are constantly evolving and, the knowledge well that we draw from continues to deepen and, these evidence-based practices are always changing and shifting. And so it's so important that we are always on, that front line of learning ourselves and growing our craft, I guess. And so I know sometimes for classroom teachers and teacher teams, it can seem a bit daunting in order, for them to think about meeting the needs of so many diverse students and meeting them where they're at, like you were talking about. So I guess that leads me to my next question would be, what help can you offer? What supports, what things could we say are maybe critical and vital that they take a look at or that they spend time digging into in order to refine those skills and better prepare them?
I do think that Ohio does have maybe some toolkits, if you will, of resources that could potentially educators really build their knowledge and skill, number one, but also put these new skill sets into practice. Maybe some step-by-step guidance, professional development. Of course, we have a very robust statewide system of support and professional learning through our state support teams, our educational service centers, and our Department of Education and other state agencies like OCALI. So there are layers of support there, and each of those agencies brings a rich set of resources. So I know that there's professional learning happening all the time in our 16 regions. And so I definitely would encourage people to take a look at their local SST and ESC websites for professional development kind of close to home, if you will. OCALI also, of course, has a conference, a yearly conference. And so there are, like OCALICon conference, there's a lot of other conferences, professional conferences that they could take part in as well. But we newly also created from OCALI a website that really houses a lot of this information. OCALI has a general website that is really packed with wonderful resources, learning opportunities, et cetera, through our Autism Center, our AT and AEM Center, Teaching Diverse Learners Center, Transition Center, UDL, Family, Early Childhood, et cetera. And we also have from the Teaching Diverse Learner Center a brand new website coming out actually just this week. And it's called Literacy Access for All one word, .org. And in that website, it really brings together a lot of what we talked about today with regard to curriculum, curriculum audit, standards-based planning, really digging into your standards and getting to know them, both the general standard, the deconstruction of it, extended standards and learning progressions. There are resources about all of those pieces in the new site. So language and literacy is also part of that. We've talked about English language arts and how important it is for our curricular tools to be aligned to the reading research. And so there are 5 chapters actually on the reading and reading research pieces, and 5 chapters really on getting to know that curriculum, that foundational knowledge that we need to plan and design instruction for our students and assessments. So a lot of great resources there as well. But I think our state really has a lot of layers of support for teachers to utilize and take part in. And of course, they're always welcome. Individuals are always welcome to reach out to all of us from the state level to the regional and local level.